Welcome to Markets Now. I'm Michelle Rook along with Jim McCormick with agmarket.net, and we're doing some analysis here post the WASDE report. We have grain and livestock futures trade both mixed. And Jim, let's start off talking about corn, probably the biggest surprise there on the bearish side of the equation. Record production, record yield, ending stocks over 2.22 billion bushels. Is that in your mind the most bearish figure that we saw in the report? Is it probably the high water mark for the year?
Well, right now, it's definitely, I'd say, the most bearish number of the report, Michelle. There's no doubt about it. That number was way above the average trade estimate, and that's putting the ending stocks closer around a 15% stocks to use, up from roughly 10% this year. And, there's no doubt about it. If you're a producer, you got to be concerned about it. Now, if you look at the market's reaction to it, overall, you kind of be, Michelle, I think maybe a little bit of a exhale. Corn's only down 4.5 cents as we record this. So maybe some of this is a little bit priced in on the new crop. But in the big picture, I think what you got to look at is what's going to happen. We've lost about 50 cents into this report. So some of it's priced in. A lot of that probably had to do with the Brazil crop getting a little bit bigger. I'm sure we'll get into that in a moment. But in the long run, what's probably going to happen is if this 2.222 billion projected carryout comes to fruition, as we get into later in the season, closer to harvest, I would expect the corn market especially to be under quite a bit of pressure. But right now, maybe we're going to hold here a little bit till we get a lot of what ifs. I do think the odds are that acreage number is going to go a bit lower, Michelle. That yield, it could come into fruition, even though it is an astronomically high yield. That'd be 5 bushels better than before. But I want to make note, we are moving into El Nino year fast. Historically, in El Nino years, I believe 14 out of 17, we hit trend yield or better. So you could make an argument weather-wise if that yield may be attainable as high as it is.
Not to be even more bearish, but when you go from old crop to new crop ending stocks, that's up 805 million bushels from last year. Have we ever had that big of a transition up or not, Jim?
Without digging into the records, Michelle, I would say it's probably one of the, if not the highest, it's definitely one of the highest. I mean, it just shows you what happens. When prices get high, the world and the U.S. respond. We are responding accordingly. And we're unfortunately probably going to swing the pendulum from essentially having very tight stocks to drawing down stocks to essentially we're going to start building stocks both domestically and internationally.
You also mentioned Brazil. USDA upped their production on corn by 5 million metric tons, didn't they?
They put it up 5 million. I think that's getting close to in line where it's at. Now, it is going to be a little bit interesting, Michelle, to see what happens over the next couple of weeks. In the fact that the weather forecast in Brazil is cool, but it's dry, and they still have a few more weeks to go for finishing pollination as well as grain fill. So maybe they topped out their crop a little bit, but in general, it's a very big crop, and that's part of the reason why we saw the old crop carryout grow. The government cut exports, and part of the reason why they're cutting exports is China's just not buying the corn, and some of the corn they actually bought, we know, they canceled the last couple of weeks and shifted that demand to Brazil. So that's definitely a concern.
No doubt. Let's move over to soybeans, Jim. Production was increased to about 4.5 billion bushels. We saw an increase in ending stocks as well to 335 million bushels. Now, the transition there from old crop to new crop, only 120 million bushels, but this is still pretty bearish, isn't it, for what the trade had expected?
It's higher than what the trade is expecting, and that would argue also that as we get into into the growth season, as long as this crop looks like it's getting planted, maturing as anticipated, it's probably going to argue prices are going to work lower. So if you are a producer, it's just like corn rallies at this point in time. I think you got to argue are going to be opportunities to market what you have left of old crop as well as new crop.
But do you think we can hit this production number, especially when you have some of the acres up in the north that may not get planted? I'm sure that's an argument folks are going to have.
You're going to make an argument, but the one thing I'm seeing, Michelle, when you look at the crop insurance payment that some people are looking at, I think the odds are you're going to lose more corn acres in the Dakotas and maybe bean acres, and you might see people like kind of shift when they're making that decision because the plant date comes in pretty quick. I believe it's the 25th of May for North Dakota. So I don't know if, like I said, I'm anticipating the lost acres to come out of corn instead of beans.
All right. You said that you think we need to be lower priced here for a 335 million bushel ending stocks figure. So where do you eventually think we need to be to price this in?
Well, I think in the long run, you're probably going to push this market down below 12 when it's all said and done. You look at corn, I think corn, with that corn carry out coming in around 2.2 billion, if that's correct, you're going to push that corn market down near 4. So they're just going to have to go competitively get down to, match each other.
And move over to wheat. That was actually the bull story in this report, especially on the hard red winter wheat crop. That was well below expectations, wasn't it?
That was probably the shock of the marketplace. I mean, I think the trade is a little bit optimistic on the wheat crop. A lot of our clients said, hey, abandonment's high. This is a disaster. We've been hearing that. The USDA hadn't been reporting it. That number came in today. They're definitely showing it. And the market responded, accordingly and really kind of pushed higher in the wheat market, Michelle. And I think that is providing the corn market a little bit of support as well.
Is the abandonment there? So do small crops get smaller in this case?
I would believe so. I think it is abandonment. I mean, they did get some rain. I know people are pointing to, but the reality is a lot of it was probably too little, too late. And I think if they did get rain, they may try to plant another crop. So I would not be surprised, Michelle, if this crop does get smaller down the line.
Great. Where do you think we need to be price-wise here? Ending stocks are actually down about 42 million bushels from last year with the number that we got today for the new crop.
Right now, Michelle, I think it's a little bit tricky to guess right at the moment because the reality is our crop's getting a little bit smaller. But, you've still got, not to bring a little bit of politics in, but you still got, as we're speaking, they still don't know that grain corridor is going to open up. Okay. If they can't keep that grain corridor open, you're talking about 7% of the world wheat market supply coming off the market that comes out of the Ukraine, 15% of the corn, by the way. So that could provide a little bit of support. Also, the El Nino, which does bring good weather to the United States, it does bring bad weather to Australia. So the Australian crop could be a little bit in trouble this year potentially. So that might provide the wheat a little bit of support. So in general, it's probably going to be a little bit more of a choppy, volatile trade near term in the wheat market.
Yeah, HRW has had a big run off the lows, though. I think it was $1.50 before we had the 40 cents that we tacked on here during midday here today. So how much farther can we stretch that thing now?
Right now, I think technically you're probably on a Friday right now. This may be the high end of the move for the day. Then we're going to wait and see, reevaluate, see how the rain comes in next week, as well as this grain corridor at the moment.
I also got to ask you about spring wheat because that production number is well below last year. Do you think that that's fair considering that we may not get some of these acres planted? Is that why USDA went that direction?
That's why they went that direction. And I would guess, just like corn, if you're going to ban it, it's probably going to move away from wheat at this point in time. I've had clients up in North Dakota tell me, seed dealers say, there's a lot of clients are returning the seed wheat and buying beans to plant. So I would expect the wheat acres in the Dakotas, spring wheat acres, to shrink back when it's all said and done.
Okay. Any other takeaways from today's report, Jim, that you want to share?
Well, one thing I'm going to share is we really, as an industry, really dig into these numbers, Michelle. But, people got to remember, you've got to start somewhere. This is a starting point. But remember, on these, we don't finish these numbers to a year and a half from now, till August of 2024. So these numbers are going to change dramatically. So don't get hung up too much on them. They're going to change. But the big picture is, unfortunately, is we are in a stocks rebuilding mode, and rallies are probably meant to be sold.
And now we're going to be watching weather, right?
It moves on to the weather right now. We're going to see what gets planted, and then we'll see what June, July weather pertains. La Nina years been bullish. El Nino years are bearish. That's what we're watching for now.
All right. Thanks so much for joining us with your analysis. Jim McCormick with agmarket.net, and that's Markets Now.